I would like to thank the International People's Tribunal for this opportunity to speak about the many violations of international humanitarian law that have taken place and continue to take place in the Philippines today. My presentation aims to put in proper perspective the current counterinsurgency program of the Philippine government that is inspired, financed, trained, and supplied with weapons by the United States government. It is a framework used to suppress the Filipino people from exercising their civil, political, socio-economic, and cultural rights. Counterinsurgency operations supposedly target the armed revolutionary movement led by the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army, and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, but have been expanded to include unarmed civilians, particularly activists, human rights defenders, members of the press, government critics, the political opposition, members of progressive parties and people's organizations, and communities suspected of harboring rebels. Worse, following the whole-of-nation approach prescribed in U.S. military doctrines, the entire civilian bureaucracy, from the national down to the local government units, has been transformed into a mechanism for counterinsurgency. Such has been the failed approach of the reactionary Duterte and Marcos regimes in addressing the roots of the armed conflict in the Philippines. Let me provide a historical context to this matter. The United States has played a key role in Philippine counterinsurgency campaigns, starting with the American occupation at the turn of the 20th century. When the US colonized the Philippines, it developed counterinsurgency tactics that it would later use in its wars of aggression around the world. Scorched earth tactics were used in Samar Island, turning it into what they then called a howling wilderness, where entire villages were burned and civilians were massacred, including children over the age of 10 capable of bearing arms, were massacred. In Mindanao Island, the pacification and cooptation of Moro leaders were done in tandem with the massacre of entire Moro villages. The Moro people in Mindanao are mostly Muslim communities. The water cure torture method used in Guantanamo was first used in the Philippines during this time. When the Philippines was granted nominal independence by the US government in 1946, after 48 years of colonization, it was preconditioned on the continued stay of US military bases and facilities through the 1946 Military Bases Agreement. This was followed in 1947 by the Military Assistance Agreement that entrenched US military advisors in the country through the Joint US Military Advisory Group, ensuring that the armed forces of the Philippines continually adhered to US military doctrine and dependence on US weapons, military equipment, and supplies. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty tied Philippine security and defense interests with that of the US, leading to the formation of the Mutual Defense Board in 1958 to address conventional threats, and the Security Engagement Board in 2006 to address terrorism and other non-traditional security concerns. Since then, the US has supported every puppet regime that came to power, providing them with military arms and equipment, training and advice, sometimes even directly involving US troops in combat operations. This partially explains the continued presence of US military troops, bases, and facilities in the country. In turn, these US-backed regimes sought to suppress the Filipino people's continuing struggle for genuine democracy and national and social liberation. In 1991, the Philippine Senate decided to abrogate the military bases agreement, leading to the dismantling of the US's largest military bases outside the US mainland, Subic Naval Base in Zambales and Clark Airfield in Pampanga. However, succeeding agreements, particularly the 1998 Visiting Forces Agreement, the 2002 and 2017 Mutual Logistics and Supply Agreement, and the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, have allowed US troops, military equipment, vessels, and facilities to be deployed in all parts of the country, not just in the two military bases, but in all parts of the country, virtually making the Philippine Islands one big US military facility. In the early 2000s, the war on terror was used as a pretext to establish permanent US military presence in Mindanao Island and direct involvement by US troops in counterinsurgency and counter-terror operations. Since 2001, annual military exercises and drills are held all over the country in known rebel strongholds or strategic areas for the US Pacific strategy. By the early 2010s, the US pivot to Asia amid the rise of China was used as the pretext for the return of US bases through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Thus, whether it was the anti-communist campaign of the CIA-backed Magsaysay regime in the 1950s, the open fascist rule of the Marcos dictatorship in the 70s, the US-funded low-intensity conflict strategy of the Aquino and Ramos regime of the 80s, or the US-inspired war on terror of the 2000s, the US hand has been present through every iteration of the Philippine counterinsurgency drive and its resulting human rights and IHL violations. Let me now discuss the worsening violations of international humanitarian law under the US-backed Duterte and Marcos regimes. The Duterte regime became notorious for its gross and systematic violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in relation to its anti-illegal drug and anti-insurgency or counter-terrorism campaign. Duterte's brutal war on drugs killed thousands of suspected illegal drug users and small-time peddlers, for which he is currently being investigated by the International Criminal Court for committing crimes against humanity. Eventually, Duterte trained his sights on the revolutionary movement, using the very same tactics of his drug war. In December 5, 2017, after causing the collapse of the peace talks with the NDFP, President Duterte issued Proclamation number 374, declaring the CPP-NPA as a terrorist organization under the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act of 2012. It is important to note that Duterte based his proclamation on the US government's own designation of the CPP-NPA as a foreign terrorist organization issued years earlier on August 9, 2002. In November 2018, Duterte issued Memorandum Order number 32, deploying additional military and police forces in the province of Samar, the whole Negros Island, and the Bicol region to, quote-unquote, suppress lawless violence and acts of terror. These areas are known strongholds of the New People's Army. The following month, on December 4, 2018, Duterte issued Executive Order number 70, institutionalizing the whole-of-nation approach in counterinsurgency, patterned after the US Counterinsurgency Guide, and creating the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or NTF-LCAC, to oversee the implementation of the order. Through these policies, Duterte, with the connivance of the US government, unleashed the very same drug war tactics that led to massive and systematic extrajudicial killings and other violations of human rights and IHL on members, sympathizers, and anyone remotely linked or suspected to have links to the revolutionary movement. What resulted was a horrific increase in incidents of red tagging, terrorist labeling, public vilification, illegal and arbitrary arrests and detention, filing of trumped-up charges, enforced disappearances, indiscriminate firing, shelling and bombings, forced displacement, extrajudicial killings, and executions. Meanwhile, the US government, while overtly being critical of Duterte's drug war and closeness to China, was fully supportive of his counterinsurgency campaign. Under Duterte, the Philippines was the largest recipient of US military assistance in the Indo-Pacific, receiving more than 48.6 billion pesos in security assistance from 2015 to 2021. The US gave $600 million in military aid to the Duterte regime, despite Duterte's constant rants and posturing against the US. In 2017, at the height of the drug war-related and counterinsurgency-related killings, the US authorized $1.4 billion in defense articles and service exports to the Philippines. In 2019, it authorized the export of $56 million in firearms, guns, and ammunition. Joint military operations, exercises, trainings, and exchanges continued, facilitated through the Mutual Defense Board and the Security Engagement Board. Despite widespread calls for the repeal of Proclamation Number 374, Memorandum Order Number 32, Executive Order Number 70, and the resumption of the stalled peace negotiations with the NDFP, Duterte's successor, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the incumbent president, adopted Duterte's counterinsurgency program lock, stock, and barrel. So far, Marcos has ignored the calls of two UN special rapporteurs to abolish the NTF-ELCAC. The current National Security Policy 2023 to 2028 of the Marcos regime is the latest iteration of the whole-of-nation and whole-of-government approach adopted from the US Coin Guide. It reaffirms the mobilization of the entire government machinery for counterinsurgency operations. It upholds the role of the discredited NTF-ELCAC and hails its achievements, so-called achievements, despite its notorious human rights record. Marcos's security policy also doubles down on targeting unarmed activists by saying that the government shall strengthen its actions against the, quote, legal fronts of the CPP-NPA's NDF to stop recruitment, cut financial sources, and debunk their propaganda, unquote. The NSP, the National Security Program, pays lip service to any meaningful peace negotiations that address the root causes of the armed conflict. So-called localized peace talks are used as political cover to force civilians to surrender and be presented to the public as rebels. This phenomena of forced surrenders of unarmed civilians after being coerced and threatened by the military is well documented. The terrorist labeling of revolutionary groups, as well as unarmed civilians, has contributed to the widespread violations of human rights and IHL. The prevailing mindset within the armed forces is that these so-called terrorists should not be accorded any rights. Thus, the brutal murders, massacres, forced displacement, abductions, and public vilification of all those labeled as terrorists. Many known revolutionaries have been executed after being served spurious arrest and search warrants. Often, the executions are presented as armed encounters, even if the targets were sick or unable to fight back and no encounter ever took place. Worse, entire communities suspected of harboring terrorists are also subjected to gross violations of IHL. There are numerous reports of indiscriminate shelling and bombing of farmers' villages in the Cordillera and Cagayan Valley regions, Samar and Negros Islands, and various parts of Mindanao. The testimonies to be presented in the course of this hearing will bear this all out. There appears to be a prevailing thinking within the AFP, the armed forces, and the Philippine government in the aftermath of the US war on terror and the US concept of unlawful enemy combatants, that revolutionaries designated as terrorists are not entitled to any rights and protections under the Geneva Convention. This thinking has been hinted at by the Philippine government, no less, in its report to the UN Human Rights Council during the Universal Periodic Review in 2022, where it cited an alleged debate among civil society groups on whether human rights protection can only be accorded to, quote, those who do not advocate or resort to violent extremism to reform society, unquote. The implication of this line of thinking is that those who have been designated by the Philippine government as terrorists and branded as violent extremists in procedures that lack transparency and due process are no longer entitled to protection under IHL. What distinguishes Marcos from Duterte is his unabashed allegiance to the US. He has abandoned his predecessor's dalliance with China and has pivoted back to the country's former colonizer. In February 2023, after less than a year in office, Marcos granted the US 4 additional sites for its military facilities under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, bringing the total to 9. 3 of the additional sites are in northern Luzon, close to the Taiwan Strait, a known flashpoint for the China-US conflict in the region. This was followed in April 11 to 28, 2023, by the largest Balikatan joint military exercises in history between the two countries, with 17,600 members of the US and Philippine Armed Forces participating. A month later, on May 2, 2023, the Philippines and US Defense Secretaries signed a new bilateral defense guidelines to modernize the alliance under the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. The new guidelines redefine the scope of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty to include armed attacks in the South China Sea in preparation for the escalating conflict with China. The guidelines also covered security threats from space and cyberspace, as well as any form of asymmetric, hybrid, and irregular warfare and gray zone tactics. Aside from pushing the Philippines closer to a shooting war with China, these developments also ensure even more funding and support for the Marcos government's counterinsurgency operations. In April 2024, the US Congress passed a bill providing additional $500 million in foreign military financing to the Philippines. Now, why is all this happening? The end goal of the counterinsurgency operations is to pacify and suppress all forms of resistance, from the armed national liberation struggle to the legal democratic mass movement, so that the reactionary government can impose a whole array of anti-people policies and programs, from foreign mining operations, land grabbing for agribusiness corporations, infrastructure such as dams, depressed wages, and oppressive working conditions. Many of the massacres, extrajudicial killings, and forced displacements and forced surrenders have targeted communities and individuals at the forefront of people's resistance to feudal and semi-feudal exploitation in the countryside. Any form of organizing on issues is linked by the state to the armed struggle and thus becomes a military target. The issue of human rights and IHL violations cannot be divorced from the overall socio-economic and political situation in the Philippines. The counterinsurgency and counter-terror drive serve to preserve an oppressive status quo that the Filipino people have every right to oppose and dismantle. I should emphasize that the Philippines is a state party to the Geneva Conventions and various conventions and protocols, including involving international humanitarian law. We even have a domestic law, Republic Act number 9851, on crimes against international humanitarian law, genocide, and other crimes against humanity. The executive department has declared August 12th of every year in the Philippines as International Humanitarian Law Day. I think we're the only country to have that kind of a day. Likewise, the NDFP has on its own accord, as party to the Philippine armed conflict, has declared its adherence to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and Protocol 1 of 1977. Both parties are signatory to the Joint Agreement on Human Rights and International Humanitarian Law that affirms their commitment to jointly and separately uphold human rights and IHL in the course of the armed conflict. Despite this, the violations happen because of a US-backed counterinsurgency policy that makes such violations systematic and widespread. We urge this tribunal, therefore, to carefully examine the cases that will be presented, which highlight the gravity of the IHL violations in the Philippines, and relate these to the prevailing social conditions and why resistance exists in the first place. Thank you and good morning.